thank you very much for coming on a lovely, almost summer's evening. We know that Oxford has many attractions. Each one of you is a physical representation of about 100 people who will be in the ether online, either now or in the next week or two. And so you are particularly important. You're the visible audience. And so if you all fall asleep, you're telling us that we're not interesting to thousands of people, right? So thank you very much for coming and appreciate your power. You're each standing in for 100 people or so. Now, this event has taken quite a while to organize because everybody's so busy, but it's something that's very, very dear to my heart. It's about places, poor places, that have been left behind, and Britain, it is replete of places that have been left behind and at best had things done to them by our ridiculously over-centralized government in London. And of the places left behind, actually the most emblematic are the northern coastal towns. And by a miraculous set of circumstances, I have come to know the people who are instrumental in reviving two of those emblematic coastal towns, as Blackpool and Grimsby. Under the tender mercies of having things done to them by Whitehall and by London-based finance, they spiraled down for years. They had been proud and very successful places, but they spiraled down under the tender guidance of what was done to them from London. And more recently, they've started to take control into their own hands, such limited control and resources as they've got, and they've used those powers and resources to begin the process of spiraling up. Now, Blackpool turned from spiraling down to spiraling up a few years ago, maybe 7 years ago. And so there's clear, visible progress in spiraling back up. They've done it themselves. Right? Grimsby, it's more recent. It's more recent. They're using some of the same techniques, but these two have both innovated locally, and they can learn from each other, and we can all learn from both of them. And so I'm going to start. The Grimsby team is led by Jason Stockwood, and in 15 minutes or so, he and genuine, authentic people who've come all the way from Grimsby to be here, they will tell the story collectively of how Grimsby is beginning to use its own agency to spiral up. But we're going to start with Baroness Valentine, who's been instrumental in that process of spiraling up in Blackpool. And so I'm going to start with Baroness Valentine and ask you please tell the story of Grimsby for about 10 or 15 minutes.
On condition you call me Jo from now on.
I think Baroness gives an appropriate air of gravitas to an Oxford occasion. But yes, Jo, off you go.
Okay. Thank you very much. Paul sprung this on me about 5 minutes ago that he wanted me to talk for 15 minutes, so I have no idea quite what I'm going to say to you all. But I see Jeremy in the audience, with whom I worked on London, and the sort of approach that I personally applied in Blackpool is a business leadership model. I don't think it has to be the model that one goes in to create the sort of agency that Paul talks about, but that happens to be the way I come at these things. And I suppose, so I led something called London First for decades, which was about regenerating London, which many people in the North would think didn't need any regeneration. But having left London First in 2016, I think, I went to see whether I could do something to work in Blackpool. One of the things I learned from working in London First, and we were sort of getting into this conversation in Grimsby, is about false starts. Most of the things that are new with new people I try to do don't get it right first off, and that happens for about 18 months. So there's a bit about the spider climbing up and falling down again. It's just keeping going, and eventually things do align. Jeremy, as you will know, lobbying on Crossrail, 10 years, just keeping going. It's a sensible solution. You just got to keep going. Anyway, but I think the parallel applies to the work in Blackpool. So, turning to Blackpool itself, I wouldn't argue particularly that national government did bad things to Blackpool. I mean, the other than failing to devolve powers, which is your point, Blackpool suffered because people who used to go to Blackpool started going to Spain or abroad for seaside holidays. And so, I don't know which decades I'm talking about, but certainly the last century. The old sort of model of the staycation, go to Blackpool, stay in a B&B, all disappeared. The B&Bs didn't keep up. Blackpool itself didn't keep up. And those B&Bs over a 20-year period turned into slums. And that is still a very, very tough problem sitting in the middle of Blackpool. You're talking 10,000 odd units, I think. Now, houses are multiple occupation, so they're in the private sector, and they're an easy way for people to make money. I think you make the second highest return in Britain on those slums, because all the people in them get paid housing benefit, which bizarrely is ready money for the people who are in the slums, and so it sort of doesn't work the way people intend it to work. Anyway, that's what you've got in Blackpool. That's where Blackpool was heading. You may recall there was this idea of a huge casino that was going to go in Blackpool, and then Manchester nicked it, and that was, I would think, the early part of this century, roughly that sort of time. And that was a top-down solution. That was, shove in a big casino and that'll sort it out. That was sort of the right idea, because Blackpool, I'm sure doesn't want to be described like this, but in one sense is a sort of theme park, and investing in the sort of Las Vegas of the North feel of Blackpool, I think is the right sort of thought. So it picked up part of the right idea, I think. Anyway, business in the community, which I work for 2 days a week. When I was working in Blackpool, I worked for 3 days a week, being up in Blackpool, has been sort of trying to do something helpful with Blackpool for a long time, talking about this failing a few times before you get going, really. So when I left London First, was approached by Julia Cleverdon, who will mean something to some people, to say, would I like to go up and work in Blackpool? To which I said, no, I'm fine, thank you. I've just, why would I go to Blackpool? And then she asked me again, and then she asked me again. So she's one of those spiders that falls down and climbs back up again. So anyway, eventually, of course, I went up to Blackpool and was completely taken by the challenge. But what you find going into that sort of situation is that everybody is used to a narrative of failure. So and I've done this in many. We set up an inward investment agency in the East End of London and the East End it remains very poor in patches. And people simply can't get their heads around talking about the assets they've got. They like to camp on the problem. And as we were discussing earlier, actually government requires you to camp on the problem, because if you want any money, you have to say how poor you are. Ditto the charitable world. Want any money, you have to say how awful you are. So they're very used to the narrative of failure. So when you go in and start saying, what have you got here that's good? It's really, it sort of doesn't compute. So that is what one's faced with when one first enters these sorts of situations. And that's partly what this 18-month thing is about. It's a can't-do attitude as opposed to can-do attitude. What business in the community had done for years, which is a very good program, is put things people call connectors into places, and they just put people for 2 years in to go and try and join the dots. And in business in the community's case, they go and find from business bits and pieces to help charities. So it could just be paint to paint a fence or whatever. It was just sort of trust building, relationship building in the communities. And business in the community had sort of knocked around and failed a bit for several years in Blackpool, but put in a very tenacious connector. And he was the one who kept rattling the cage and saying, Julia, come and find somebody to come and do this. So when I went up to talk to the council had already told business community to get lost once or twice. And when I was, they'd sort of were prepared to tolerate me coming up to have a chat with them. But I chatted to the chief executive, who was understandably sceptical, because the number of times they have people come in, say, we're going to come in and help you, come in for 2 years, mess around, do something they find interesting, sometimes succeed. In fact, there was a 10-year program about teenage pregnancy which succeeded. The minute they went away, it went back again. So obviously sceptical of any external influence, and because Blackpool has this interesting problem at one level of the slum in the middle, lots of people come in and sort of prod around, and actually we were talking about universities also earlier. The universities are some of the culprits because they love researching it, and the last thing you want to be if you're in that situation is researched. So the council was sceptical. I suppose I should be talking about how we go from the narrative of failure to success. The way that I would approach going into somewhere like Blackpool is to go and find the movers and shakers in the patch. And as I said earlier, I start from a business standpoint, so I go and find the major businesses in the patch. I would, for that sort of situation, have to have a relationship with the council leader or chief executive level, as an ability to have a discussion with them. They don't have to be enthusiastic, but just, an ability to treat with them. And then the voluntary sector, third sector, civic institutions are very important glue in a sense. But where I start from is getting the business to the table. They're quite reluctant to come to the table. It's not their day job. Whereas for a lot of the public sector, it is their day job, or for a lot of the charities, it's their day job. So they feel a bit hesitant themselves frequently. But if you get senior business people who can be strategic and can work with the other sectors, they can be worth their weight in gold. They automatically come at these same problems where people are used to camping on the problem and used to a can't-do attitude. They automatically come to a problem and say, there's no point in boiling the ocean. You can write as many papers as you like about it, but actually let's get this down to what we're going to do first year, third year, seventh year. So they'll get the problem into bite-sized chunks. And that probably is related to having a can-do attitude, because if you look at the whole ocean, you just think you're never going to do anything with it. So you just get it into manageable chunks, whatever it is, that thing about biting bits of an elephant or whatever, and they start work on the manageable chunks. So I'm going to have to accelerate now, so shall I just accelerate to the end? Would that be good? So we put together a group of a business leadership group. Business and community helps in this instance because it has national authority and could bring in business people from outside Blackpool to come in and take an interest and support, and government connections as well. But a core part of that was about Andy Charles, the connector, who'd been in Blackpool, came from Blackpool for 2 years or something already, and he hadn't raised it to this level, but he got all that groundwork of the relationships, a bit like you must be doing in Grimsby. And so we just put a sort of structure above that, which was to say, look, we're going to have 3 priorities, we're going to deal with this in bite-sized chunks, we're going to start work on some stuff. We did do some work on visioning with the broader community, because I know it's important to involve the broader community. So we knew in sort of preparing a one-page vision, because it's business, not that we needed to get the feel of the place rather than in any sense dictated. But so it was a mixture of listening and then putting a bit of structure around the way forward. And nowadays, anyway, it's got a sort of £1 billion programme that sits 5 years on the way through, which is lots of buildings. It is working on sorting out how you educate better and the sort of social challenges in parallel. Those are much longer term, much more difficult really in some ways. But in a way, the buildings create the confidence and also the opportunity, and we're in parallel then working a slightly longer route through youth clubs and whatever to try. I think probably quite similar to the sort of way you're thinking of working of creating a community asset, you know, all that sort of stuff we're working at. I'll shut up.
Thank you very much. So, 2 things I took from that, with lots of things, but one was that expect for the first 18 months to have a lot of setbacks. People are not in a mindset to succeed, they're in a mindset to fail. And so it takes time, persistence, to try and to reverse that. It can be reversed, but people start skeptical. And the other thing I took was a really powerful word, connectors. People fragment in societies where there's failure. They blame each other, they blame somebody, they blame a scapegoat, they're in a psychology of blame, and that digs deeper into the problem, where somehow you've got to get out of that and start to see opportunities that you didn't notice before. And connectors are a good way of bringing people together around some vision of the future. I was fascinated that you said a 1 year, a 3 year, a 7 year horizon. That's exactly what I teach in public policy. If you don't have a 1 year horizon of what you're going to change, you're into the Einstein problem of the definition of madness. You remember Einstein's definition of madness? If you keep doing the same thing, expecting different, you're mad, right? And so that's the 1 year strategy for do something different. And then the 7 year strategy is, in 7 years' time, how do we expect things to have made significant progress? That's a 7 year strategy. It's as far ahead as you can sensibly look. And then in between is, do we have the capacities we need for all this? No. So let's build them. That's the medium-term strategy. On that note, let's hear it from Grimsby.
Thank you for coming tonight. Anything with Grimsby in the title doesn't normally get this amount of attention, so I'm pleased that you've all turned up in the first instance. I don't want to give the impression that this is as coherent as it's going to sound as well, so what I'd like to do is tell our stories, maybe. We've been working on this for the last number of years, but the friendship that we have as partners in this, it's probably easier if maybe, Josie, if you tell the story of Grimsby, I can tell my connection and then Bill can talk about the East Marsh United. That probably works. It gives it the semblance of coherence. And if you start with the historical stuff.
Want me to tell a story?
Yeah, it's that.
All right, okay. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you our founding myth to start with. So we are the B of Grim, which means we are a Viking settlement of an individual whose name was Grim, who came from Denmark with a boy king on his shoulders who he was instructed to drown in the North Sea. And he refused his orders from the King of Denmark, and he settled on our shore, and the boy survived, and in mythology became the King of England, whatever that was in the Dark Ages, and Denmark eventually, and the town was called Grimsby. And all around us we've got Thorsby, Swaby, Beesby, so we are a Viking settlement. But guess what? Grim was a fisherman. Okay, so he came in his little rowing boat, and he landed in Grimsby, and he set up a settlement. And something about that seems to have seeped into the psyche. In the sort of medieval period, it was all pasture land and sheep. And we have an organisation in Grimsby called the Freemen, who were gifted a whole load of land and sheep pasture. And that institution was settled in about the early sort of 13th century, still going reasonably strong. In the interim, middle of the 19th century, the railway arrived, bringing people to Cleethorpes, which is the nice destination bit just after Grimsby, a little bit further along the A180. But also, importantly, bringing the railway to the docks, which meant that fish could be landed from the Arctic and transported quickly out of the town. So from the middle of the 19th century to about the early 70s, Grimsby was all about the fish. And it thrived, it grew. And there's a whole mythology around fishing now, because of course, what's happened to fishing? It's gone, it finished. It was finished in by the early 80s really, through a combination of cod wars with Iceland, which were real and violent and unpleasant, through the shenanigans of international powers, NATO bases, all sorts of things going on, and no will from government to maintain what was the single industry of our town. Now, we weren't the only place that was pretty much destroyed by the cod wars and this. Hull lost its fishing, and so did Fleetwood and other places, coastal places. But it was particularly significant for us. And the fish in its heyday, people will eulogise. If you get into a pub with an old tar in Grimsby, they'll tell you how glorious it was. The 3-day millionaires, the lads who came off the boats, off the docks after 3 weeks at sea, money spilling out of their pockets, these suits, all the pubs down Freeman Street, full taxis, just a taxi outside waiting, while the missus, was following you from pub to pub to get the money out of your pocket so she could feed the kids. Now, it was a kind of an early example of 0 hours contracts. These men were not unionised. There was no health and safety. They got on a 30-foot smack if the skipper wanted them, and they went to the Arctic Circle for 3 weeks. And shore leave was 3 days. And if you had a good catch, everybody was happy. But if it was a poor catch, your kids didn't get fed, and your wife probably got beaten senseless. Because let's not romanticise this. There was a huge amount of violence. There was a tipping between plenty and scarcity. And there were stories of women, as the second that boat was out, down the pawn shop with everything she could pawn so she got enough money to last for the next 3 weeks. The women have got a real story to tell about the fishing industry that's probably quite different to the men's. But it went. And with it, the East Marsh, where Billy and I live and work, went as well. Concrete houses in a grid. No front gardens, straight onto the street. Okay, little yards at the back, thin little alleyways. It has become, to use your word, Joe, a slum. The houses are not fit for human habitation. There is grinding poverty, because when that single industry went, nothing came to replace it. So we have our founding myth of the Great Grim and this bee of Grim. We have our story of fishing, which lifted us and deposited us, over an arc of time. Now we've got to look at how we tell a new story. And that is a beautiful point to hand over to you, Jason.
Well, wonderfully told, Josie. So I'm part of that story, by the way. So I was born in the 70s in Grimsby. I was a council estate kid, so I'm a complete product of the welfare state, council housing, free school meals. I don't know who my dad is to this day, which isn't uncommon in our town. I've got 3 brothers by different dads, and one of my mum's husband was a fisherman. So we were subject to that violence, and we were subject to that scarcity and wealth and alcoholism. But it's not a sob story. This is a normal story in our town. But, what our town breeds is a type of resilience and persistence and good humour, dark humour a lot of the time. And I don't think that's unique to Grimsby, but we have our own sense of style, how we carry that and how we wear that. But my story is also one of sort of the myth of meritocracy as well, the sort of up and out. So I didn't do particularly well at school. I was bright, but I didn't apply myself. But I did get a scholarship to go to high school in America, and I just continued travelling. So I left the town at 18, I went to school in America, I went on a kibbutz in Israel, I worked at Disney World at Florida, not Mickey Mouse, by the way, for anyone that jumps in there. And then while I was away, I started to read and educate myself. And this is, I'm sorry to all the younger people here now, but it was the last year you could get a free student grant and your education paid for, as horrific and absurd as that was. And so I went to university at the age of 23 and I studied philosophy. At the time when people told me you needed to be an engineer and you needed to do something that was more practical, but I did it because I loved it and I did it because I was interested in it, not because it would get me a job. And then the other myth of meritocracy is that if you work hard and apply yourself, you'll get on. And I'll come back to why Paul's an inspiration for me. I came here a couple of years ago, but we know this now. The single most determinant of your success is where you're from, who your parents are, and the inherited privileges. And that's not demonising people who have that, but it's a reality about the maths and the probability of success in any dimension if you're from a town like ours. And I used to believe it because I grafted and I worked hard and I ended up in London in the 90s. The reality is I went there to go clubbing and I stayed for 5 years. But there's this thing called the internet that was being invented. And because I was curious and because I applied myself, I got involved with it and I knew a bit more than most other people. And I was really fortunate, and it's nothing but good luck, which is the myth of meritocracy. Hard work is a necessary condition of success, but it's not sufficient. I was really lucky. I met some people that founded a business called lastminute.com that some of you will know. I spent 5 years there on the ride of that. I then went and launched Match.com, the dating business. I invested in Skyscanner, the travel business. And then I built something called Simply Business. So anyway, I spent 20 years as a meat-eating capitalist. Bearing in mind, I'm a complete socialist from my natural heritage of how I was brought up. And while I was doing that, I was really struck by the fact that you had to pick a side. You could be one or the other. You could be a capitalist and believe in that global story and that idea that we're all privileged and we could all benefit from the graft that we put in. And yet it never made sense to me. And the businesses for me was about building community, about building places of aspiration where we solve problems, usually with high-tech solutions in my instance. But the things I really enjoyed about it was the cultures. And so I ended up studying and thinking about culture. I wrote a book on the future of work a couple of years ago. And then I'll start to wrap up here, but in 2016, it was June the 25th, the date that some of you might remember, and I was in New York and I was raising money for a business, and it was almost like a scene from a movie. I was in Madison Avenue at the top of this building looking down to Central Park, and I was raising money from a private equity company. And they asked me how the Brexit vote was going to go the next day. And I said to them, with no sense of irony, I said, it's never going to happen. And the reason for that is I'm a Grimsby kid, but by this time I was living in North London with an international community of friends, with an international lifestyle, well-educated, with people around me well-educated. And even though I go back to Grimsby a dozen times a year to see my mum and my brothers, I'd sort of forgot where I was from. And so when I flew back the next morning and the catastrophe in my eyes was announced, I was really dumbfounded by it. And I started to, once I sort of picked myself up, I realised that I genuinely didn't understand how it happened. And so I had the amazing good fortune to bump into an incredible lady called Professor Nairi Woods, who runs the Blackpool School of Government. And I was able to come here as a kid that left school with no qualification. I'm particularly proud of that. I know I got in through the back door, but I still got in anyway. And then spend 18 months with people like Paul and people at the Blackpool School of Government. And think about the diagnosis of this problem, which we won't go into today, and Paul can speak more eloquently about it. But as I came out of that 18 months thinking of my fellowship at the Blavatnik, I was like, well, what do I build? As an entrepreneur, I was like, what do I do about this? And more importantly, how do I reconnect with the truths that I really understand about myself, that the things that have mattered to me in my life have been connection and community and love and compassion and kindness. They're the things that have driven me. And so I had this idea, and it was an idea that was inspired by conversations with Paul about, and the work of the philosopher Robert Putnam about, the things that kept capitalism in check with the civic institutions, or the work of Amartya Sen, who talked about like the capabilities that we need in communities, or the work of John Rawls about, and I can't understand why rich people don't understand the veil of ignorance argument, that if you didn't know what you're going to be born into, and you didn't understand your privilege, surely we would want a more equal society. And then the work of Paul through his books Greed is Dead, or The Future of Capitalism around, what we understand about why we've thrived as a species is not just because we're a rational economic man, it's because we're communitarians, and we believe in how we support each other. So that's a long-winded way of saying, as an entrepreneur, I was like, well, I need to go and find the others and find my tribe again and reconnect and see if we can rebuild the institutions of our town. But really, it's about connecting relationships and seeing if we can build solidarity so that we can meet industrial strategy. I think what inspires me about Joe's work and the work in Blackpool is it's the business community have come together, but we've done it slightly differently. We're saying, let's just stand shoulder to shoulder as a community. People are already doing the work, but how do we resource the work? How do we open up our networks to the work? And how do we just stand shoulder to shoulder at the work is the important thing. And so, as a professional investor, I made one of the worst decisions of my life, which is I bought a business that I know will never make money, which is a football club. So we bought Grimsby Town Football Club, which is an awful idea, by the way, for many reasons that I won't go into now. But it's the most potent civic institution that's been around for 144 years. And we thought, if we can renew the values of that and make it more inclusive, more family-orientated, more compassionate, and have aspiration and excellence alongside it, then maybe that can change the trajectory of this narrative on the town. Second thing is that we're building an on-site youth zone in the town. So there's an amazing public-private partnership where you raise the money, the government puts some money in, and we build state-of-the-art youth provision for a community. And so I'm really proud we're breaking ground on that next month. We've raised £13 million, which I'm chairing, and we're going to build that in the town centre. So it's an institution for children, for the future, for all the young people in the town. And then the third piece is how is all of this coherent? And I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a startup guy, so I struggle with coherence sometimes. And so I had the amazing good fortune and serendipity again to be introduced to a tremendous social entrepreneur, a lady called Emily Bolton, who she built the first social impact bond in the UK. She's worked at a business called Social Finance. And by partnering with Emily, we've come up with an organisation called Our Future, which is how do we hold the space for people who want to do the work in our town, people who are already doing the work in our town, and how do we convene people, how do we open up networks, how do we resource the work, and importantly, how do we show solidarity and compassion and love when it goes wrong, because it will go wrong, and show that we're here for the long haul, because it's a place that we can't walk away from, because it's where we're all from. So I'll stop there. We're 2 years into that, and do you know what? I mean, we're trying to get government to the table. I've had endless meetings with D-Look, and they say the right things, but there's nothing to show for it yet. So we're speaking, it is non-partisan, but, you know, we're speaking to both sides of the political divide, and, you know, we'll see where that goes, quite frankly, because it needs to be public and private money, I think, to show that this isn't about a consumer relationship with government, where government solves our problems. This is about saying, we're doing the work, we need your help and support at scale. But it's also about mobilising the networks globally, foundations, philanthropists, individuals that can help us with this. So anyone that can help with that, it's an open door. We'd love your support. We'd love your help. We're just getting started in that spiral analogy that Paul talks about. We're probably on the first turn. And the final thing I'd state, which is just to recap my personal story, is that, you know, I don't do anything else now. This is my life's work, and I'm committing fully to doing this. I'm fortunate that my career's allowed me financially to make these choices. But the dirty secret about this is it's been the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life. And not because of esteem or status or anything, just because of the relationships and the connection and the love that I'm reconnecting with. Living in North London with all those international people, they weren't really my people, if I'm being honest with you. So being back in the town, I don't live in the town. My wife is from Manchester, so she chooses where we live. If you know women from Manchester, you know that's how it works. But I'm there every week, and the football club's thriving, the town's starting to thrive, but importantly, the relationships are real. So the one final thing I say is that I wish that Viking was called Smilesby or something like it. Would be, you know, he didn't help us, did he, by being called, bloody hell, you know, but it is what it is. We're proud of it. And we'll try and use that narrative to tilt towards the future that is about renewable energy, but it's more about the community and our relationships. So with that in mind, I'll hand over to Bill. Josie eloquently told the story of past, but Bill's one of my good friends now, and actually it was his work that inspired me to come back to the town, because Bill's been doing this for a few years. So, Bill, hand to you, mate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Billy from the East Marsh, and the East Marsh is one ward in Grimsby, so I won't claim to speak for the whole of Grimsby, but the East Marsh has about 11,000 souls, and yeah, I think it's an easy move from grim to grit, actually, and that's one of the things that typifies Grimsby people. There's a good deal of resilience there, but there's also a good deal of people feeling absolutely battered and helpless as well. And it's really interesting to hear some of our colleagues here talking about how to theorize some of this. I entered this whole thing about 6 years ago, and I'll tell you that story, but it was really completely untheorized. It was about just cracking on, doing things and finding your way forward slowly, sometimes stumbling and falling over, but getting back up and doing it again. So this idea of spiraling up is a beautiful metaphor, actually. So we've been spiraled down, and we're trying to spiral back up. We didn't know we were, but I love the idea that when you reach the top of a spiral staircase, you have a completely different perspective. You can see where you've been. And the idea of having actually a theory of doing some of this is wonderful, Joe. So business in the community, I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and about connectors. So, and echoes in the kind of wealth extraction from some of the neglected buildings. In Grimsby's case, it's the houses that are having wealth extracted from them. So basically, in 2013, my mum died. I was working at University of Birmingham in ed tech. And so I came back to look after Dad because it turned out that he had dementia. So I kind of just came back to put a framework around him. And 3 or 4 years into that, I was kind of isolated because I'd been away about 15 years and all my old social circles had disappeared by then. So it was just me and him, really. And then there was a lot kicking off down our street. Now, I don't know if you can even imagine it. I love going hiking, and I finished the Viking Way last year, and I was walking through these beautiful little hamlets in Rutland and Leicestershire, and there's thatched roofs and sports cars, and I just thought, you know, this is a different world. And people here just couldn't even imagine the kind of social circumstances that is every day for the people in some of these rundown towns like ours. So the East Marsh literally was a marsh up until the middle of the 19th century. And then the railway came, as Josie said, and the fishing industry took off and they needed workers. So they drained the marsh and threw up all of these houses. And actually, you know, I mean, they're not quite the back-to-back experience of, say, people in Leeds. They've actually got quite long backyards and things like this, and they're long and thin, but they're spacious enough. But they're 150 years old now, so they're struggling, you know. And this is what we're left with. And basically, the council sort of sold off all its housing stock in the noughties, and casino capitalism came into action. People bought houses as a personal investment, and they were encouraged to. And it's hard to knock people for doing that. But the consequence was that the houses were owned by people who didn't see any kind of value in the people living in the homes. They just saw the value in the kind of equity in there, and keep taking that. Don't take any attention of the people, the problems in the houses and so on. So things started to kick off. We'd lost fishing, then we had austerity on top, and places like ours just really felt it. And what happened was there was a lot of things like on my block, so looking out of my house, straight onto the street, there's just another house. There's no trees, there's just a street, you know. And it became messier and messier up to 2017, when in the summer of 2017, there appeared sort of big gangs of 20 and 30 young scowling men openly dealing drugs, burning people out of the houses and beating people up. And this was the incursion of county lines drug gangs that we now understand. And so there's a big local outcry. It was in the local paper, then it was on the local telly. And so there's a big meeting. And it was a little bit like this, everybody in serried rows, but there were about 70 people there. And at the front was a local councillor, a community cop and a robo-cop. And they were just shouting at them for an hour and a half, and there were no answers forthcoming. So I don't know what entered my head, but I just stood up for 20 minutes and gobbed off, and basically talked about broken windows for some reason. So as an idea of a theory, So broken windows is this idea from 1980s America, New York, I believe, where some researchers put a car in the street and just watched it for a bit, and it was fine. But then they broke one of the little windows, and within hours, it was just stripped bare. And the theory in streets is that you get the smallest of infractions, it will grow quickly. So somebody dumps something on the street, everybody will want to dump something on the street. But the idea behind it, basically, is the message it sends is that nobody is looking after this place. And when I spoke about that, I felt that the audience were resonating with this in some way. So I offered to put together a workshop for the people there, and people left their addresses. And we had that workshop within the next couple of weeks, and 15 people came. And East Marsh United was born. It wasn't my idea. I had a really long title for it that kind of summed it up, but it's a perfect title for it, actually. And we looked at the broken windows where we are for the first half, and then what we could do to fix them for the second half. And so we went out on that Saturday morning after that meeting with our own bags and brushes and shovels, just cleaned the street. And then we did it again, and then again, and we just kept doing it for a couple of years. And much more importantly, we met together, we sat together, us local residents with no experience of any of this, and we started to work out what we could do to solve things. So what are the problems? What can we do? And what we realized, one of the biggest issues, the biggest messages for us really, was that it's not just one thing. It's everything, all at once, all the time. So 6 years later, we've ended up with projects in community arts, community education, outreach, finance, well-being. We've got housing project, 100 houses for 100 years, because we're thinking generationally. And we're about to take over a local pub as a community pub, and we've got drawings done for an East Marsh Village Hall because we wish to rethink our neighbourhood as an urban village. And to that effect, we worked with Create Streets to put 30 brand new trees into our local park, the only green space, which is a bit neglected, like the whole place. So it looks much better already. And we've got plans to have another 30 trees all the way down one of the worst streets, Rutland Street, my street, so I can say that. And so we've got all these plans and we've got all this vision, but when Paul talks about setbacks for the first 18 months, we're still having them. We might have a fantastic idea of where we want to go, and we're now growing a team, and we've got an amazing team of people working with us, but it's all so precarious because we're dependent on community group funding, charity funding, runs out after a certain time, or the policies change so you can't go for that, or they want you to do busy work, so you're making more work rather than doing the work that really needs doing. There are some good people out there, and we've found them, and they're funding salaries, because actually we just need longer term funding for the people doing the work, because we don't have retired bank managers and tech experts and people like that where we are. We have a literacy rate of 8 years old, statistically, you know. And this is all important because another statistic, we also have a mortality rate 13 years less than adjoining wards. And that's frightening. And we can only change that, as I say, by changing everything all at once, all the time. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much. What you've described, I'll put a gloss of theory on it. Huh? It's what's called a syndrome of fragility. And the fragility is the uncertainty, and it can so easily all be knocked down. And what is a syndrome? A syndrome is once you've got an initial crash, as Grimsby had, that crash causes multiple problems of poverty. And poverty is multifaceted, multidimensional. So you get one initial shock, creates lots of problems, and then all those problems interact with each other and feed back onto the original problem. Right? So the causal structure is often way too complicated ever to sort out. Right? That's what a syndrome is. The causal structure is all about interactions and feedbacks that amplify the original problem. And that's why you get worse and worse and worse. That's the spiral down. Getting out of it, as you say, involves intervening in lots of different things at once to change things. Multiple broad-based interventions, big time and persistent because it's uncertain and fragile. Right? And that's what Grimsby hasn't had from anybody else, and that's what you're doing now for yourselves. The original conception of this came because, Joe, I knew Jason and his football club, and you started to talk about Blackpool and football clubs. Would you just, over to you and a bit of comparison and comment.
On football?
On whatever you like.
I'm not a specialist on football by any means, but actually, you know, in the journey, because this is absolutely a journey one's on. We had Owen Oyston, who owned Blackpool Football Club, as you will well be aware, and the Blackpool had lost all its fans because of various shenanigans. Anyway, one of the things we did is go and find Blackpool alumni. So people who, like you, born and bred locally, actually it's quite good if they've gone somewhere else because they've got an external sort of, lens, and tried to get them to come back and support. So Blackpool Football Club was bought by such a person, Simon Sadler he's called, isn't he? Yes, about 3, 4, 5 years ago, I can't remember. But anyway, during the 7 years we're talking about. And they are now a civic part of the town. They probably haven't started from exactly where you started, but Simon wanted to come back and waste his money because had enough to waste, I guess. But they're putting in training fields, and the council's trying to work very closely with them, and it's all starting on that route.
Well, it's interesting because while I was here, and when you talk about the system of fragility, one of the things in the town is that persistence of violence, and particularly domestic violence, that started. It's interesting, someone I didn't think I'd end up quoting tonight, but Grayson Perry wrote most eloquently about this in a book called The Descent of Man, where he talks about like industrial towns, whether that was steel or shipping or mining, people were brought up and it was hard work, so they parented hard. They were violent often, and their working conditions were so awful, and so you had to be tough to endure them. And when those industries went away, that parenting style continued with nothing to be hard for anymore. And so my generation was the first generation that was brought up, like my stepdad would talk about, no interest in my schoolwork, but could I hold my beer and could I fight? And I hated it, I absolutely hated it, but it was a currency where we lived, was about fighting and drinking. And it only made sense to me when I read Grayson Perry, of all people, years later, going like, we were brought up in a way that they were brought up by their parents, and yet we didn't need to be hard or tough anymore. So it was weird, so I had to sort of go away, and maybe this is where London did, and slightly more cosmopolitan lifestyle helped me. But I was interested in poetry, I was interested in the theatre, I was interested in philosophy, which were synonyms for weakness where I was from growing up. So it's just interesting that, and we've still got some of that sort of system of fragility, which is, for me, why the football club is important, because it is a majority male environment, and not always been particularly pleasant, if I'm being honest, as a fan. And so one of the things we did was, one, we wanted to reset the values of the organisation to be more inclusive, be more aspirational, be more communitarian. So the first thing they did, the first day we came in the club, we announced the first female CEO in the football club's history. Now, she's a brilliant CEO, so it's not because she's a female, but we made a point of making sure that the club had its first female CEO. We appointed the first female board members in the 144 history of the club. And so it's a signal of we want to do things appropriately, not differently, appropriately for today. And then we've tried to make the club have a more family feel. Joe's did this amazing project with the schools in the town where we got kids from the town to write a song about being proud from being Grimsby. And it was one of the most beautiful, 100 kids who had never been to a game, most of them before, came and sang it about a month ago. And it was just the most magical experience. And so it feels like there is a power in football to convene, and there's a power in football, which for me personally, wherever I've been in the world over the last sort of 50 odd years, at 4:45, my mind always turns towards the Grimsby Town Football Squad, always has and always will. And so there's something about what has rooted my identity throughout all the different incarnations. It's about football, it's about the club. So we haven't got started on this in the way we want to. We've had an amazing, successful first 2 years where, for those who don't follow football, we got promoted out of the National League over Wrexham, for those who don't know, in the first year. Thank you for that. So we're on their documentary. Episode 14 is the good one, where we beat them. And so we got out of the National League at the first time of asking, and then we got to the quarterfinals of the FA Cup this year for the first time since 1939. So the football's kind of working, but the real opportunity is how we use it as a catalyst for social change. I heard yesterday, and I haven't got the data with me, but a lady who, Jane Etop, told me yesterday that we have the second highest male suicide rate for towns in the UK. You know, and I know...
Blackpool's got the first.
Is it real? Oh, Christ, there's a clip for us both, sorry. But it's like, I know 3 people who have lost male siblings. I mean, you shouldn't... I mean, so for me, well, how can we use football as this place of convene to talk about emotions, to talk about modern masculinity, whatever that means, but also to make sure it's an inclusive place for everybody? And we're on that journey together. So I've been inspired by, and it was a bet. And again, Paul put a lot of this in my ear. You might remember, but the idea of connecting the diaspora, you called it home win, which was a football metaphor. You know, it's like, and so we've got this program now. We've got 160 people who are from Grimsby that we meet, or usually online. Anywhere between 40 and 100 people turn up. But it's the people who, like me, and like John, who's in the audience, who's here today, who's a principal of one of the colleges here, that, you know, for all the things we've done in our lives, our childhood and our association with Grimsby is something we're very proud of. So how do we connect that diaspora through the Home Win project back to the town? But I'm convinced that football has a bigger role to play. And we're talking to the EFL Trust. There's a bunch of like-minded clubs that come together, and we're trying to, through our future work, which is with Emily Bolton I mentioned, we're trying to create, that's data-led, we're trying to get evidence for that as well, so that we can then take it to football clubs and go, look, here's a blueprint, and it won't all work for you, but here's in a number of initiatives you could try, and some of it will work, using football as the catalysing and convening force. So that's part of the plan, but I'm convinced it has a bigger role to play.
It's iconic, a football club in a place like Grimsby or Blackpool. Yeah. So it's both the sort of pride in the place, but also just practical interventions, I mean.
It's part of the process of restoring pride, which you're obviously doing.
Yeah, so for us, we had a 3-pronged strategy 2 years ago, which was just, you know, change the culture of the club. It was, and I've never spoke disparagingly about the previous owners, but it was very different to how we're talking tonight and how I personally see the world. So we wanted to change the culture, which we're on a journey of, I think we have. We wanted to improve the performance of the on-field team, because quite frankly, the majority of people don't care. The football fans, if we don't improve the football, we don't have the license to do this stuff. But I'll probably regret saying this, but I don't think that's the hard bit. If you get the right people and you spend the right amount of money, and you set the standards, different standards for football clubs, I think you can improve, certainly down our level. And the third bit was improve the infrastructure. So simple things like improve so the physical manifestation of what the club wants to be, and we're going on that journey. And then because we've had the success we're now writing a 10-year plan. So in that sort of first couple of years, we wanted to understand the asset, understand the opportunity, and we're completely emboldened by it now and energised by it. So we're currently engaging with some external help to help us write a 10-year plan, both from what we can do on the football side, but the impact in the community as well. So I'm really excited about the next 10 years, because we've built an evidence-based, much anecdotal, that there is an opportunity to use football and as an energising force for what is now has been called levelling up, but I tend not to use that phrase too much because I haven't seen that much evidence of government strategy for that, but it certainly does feel like it's lifting, as an analogy, it is certainly, we're lifting it, but we're doing the lifting ourselves, I would suggest.
Could I just ask, you sort of brought in a diaspora of business, and you've done less of that to date, but I think there's a lot of potential in that, getting people who've left but feel very attached to come back with business contacts. Would you like?
I mean, I would say two things about that. The local steering group is very much made up of the local business people. So it could be the regional manager or something, but they are the local people. We then sort of lay on top of that the outreach, which is useful, well, if you want a lot of money spent on a football club, for instance, but also, I suppose, you know, we're taking advice from people like Bob Kerslake on the housing. So people who we touch from who know Blackpool but are now elsewhere. If you're facing international government or facing international media, I mean, we all have the problem that national media just poo on these sorts of towns, and it would take a long time, and we haven't got enough resource in Blackpool to do it yet to really push it. I think it's perfectly doable to change the story, but you need to spend the resource on it. The point somebody made about just having enough money for one member of staff half the time is the thing we struggle with all the time. The one thing I'd like to, if you're on the Levelling Up Task Force, to say to government, just give us 50,000 a year to pay for one member of staff reliably for 10 years, and you'd be away to the, I don't know what, perhaps not away on holiday, that's not the right idea, but it would just, and they, anyway, don't start me on that one.
I believe in that, but actually I'd take that one step further if I could build on it, which is about setting the community to match that funding. I think building some amazing work on a community share scheme. I think if you show that there's a catalysing, and that can be government, it can be individuals.
I always say I'll match it. I always say, give me 50k, I'll match it. Yeah. But that doesn't resonate.
We're about to open it up to yours, but the psychology of the British Treasury is that it's very fearful of anybody else having any agency. And so it wants to be absolutely safe and monitor very closely to make sure that things are succeeding very quickly. And of course, if there's this 18-month rule that you were speaking about initially, you can't do that. You have to be persistent, and that's where the sort of 50,000 for some horizon comes in. And the Treasury is, at the moment, in absolutely blocking that, because it's both very short-termist and very interventionist, insisting on short-term scrutiny, value for taxpayers' money, they call it.
Well, and it's rubbish, isn't it? I mean, everybody just cheats on it. So, you know, the Community Renewal Fund, which was about a 9-month window for, and you were supposed to innovate and create new jobs. And I'm thinking, you know, anything sustainable going to be created in that time frame? Yeah. So you can cheat and say we've created 6 jobs, but, you know.
Yes. On that happy note.
But the spirit of that is correct,
No, not that I do the cheating, but, you know, it's whatever.
On that happy note, let's open it up to the audience. Comments, questions? Who'd like to get us started? And yes.
I'll do the one online.
Yep.
So Helen has said, as a further education teacher, I am dismayed by the abject neglect of FE colleges, the very institutions which are at the heart of local communities. What are your thoughts about how we can raise the esteem of vocational education and ensure colleges are properly funded to deliver the skills boost marginalised communities deserve?
So, question about College of Further Education.
We've got a great FE college, actually. You know, I can only speak from the experience of the college, and you know, I think connecting the right education to the jobs in the region is part of the challenge. I mean, there is a skills gap. I mean, if you talk to people in industry and you talk about the courses that people want to do. So, you know, I had a tour around the college about a year ago, and one of the things that I asked them is there's a lot of creative arts courses, and I'm thinking, well, I asked about the employability levels, and it's not that everyone who does creative arts should be thinking about employability levels, but there's something about making sure we're connecting the skills to the jobs that are close by as well. And then there's a meta level problem as well, which is really difficult to solve, which is, I spoke to somebody and said, part of what we're trying to do through our future is talk about how we create jobs for the green transition and maybe create an incubator, a startup environment, so people can create new businesses, because that's the stuff I've done. And part of the problem is, people in industry are saying, oh, well, we need welders as an example. I'm saying, well, actually, if we go and tell the college to train a load of welders, what you really need is to create new technologies that don't need welderless joints, basically. And so I'm really worried and anxious about, are we creating the jobs that solve the problem for the next 10 years? But then the next 10 years, and that's beyond my domain of expertise, but we sometimes ask the wrong questions, I think, about what we're trying to solve for today. But for the jobs that are needed in the town, sort of the stuff that won't go away and be replaced by technologies, I think Grimsby College is pretty good in my experience. But I don't know if you guys have had similar experience.
I think historically it has been as well. I mean, it led the way on refrigeration studies.
Yeah.
You know, years ago, I mean, people came internationally. There were people from all over the world that came and studied refrigeration in Grimsby. But I think the wider problem is that our whole education system needs to be looked at and scrutinised honestly about what it's doing from early years right the way through, because it isn't serving children and young people very well, in my opinion. I did teach for 24 years. I am allowed to say that, you know, and I think what we need to be looking at as well is we're obsessed with paper qualifications, we're obsessed with A-level grades and university. There's a school serving, you know, poorer children in our town, and you walk in and it says Stairway to University above the reception desk. And what's that saying to children who are never going to go to university, or, you know, for whom university just isn't on the horizon? We should be saying stairway to success. You know, we should be looking, what is it for each individual child that's relevant? And, of course, our education service is wildly underfunded and undervalued. And I think we need to look at, what do we value about education? Well, we should be starting with children and saying these are the people that actually matter. Children matter, and actually pedagogy matters. You know, excellent teacher training, you know. These things matter, and if we can do that and we resource it properly and we look at it from a child-centred point of view, we have this ridiculous one-size-fits-none model. Really, you know, probably many of you have got children going through, you know, school at the minute. It can be horrific for children, truly horrific. And I could cite hundreds of horrific experiences that, you know, I've had as a teacher, that I've had with young people over the years. It's not good. We need to make it not just good, but great. But we need to imagine it. We can't do anything until we imagine it. We imagine it and we do it. That's what I would say.
Just before we turn to another question, I'll just have a comment. Oh, well, sorry, yeah. Go.
Yeah, just where you actually position yourself for education matters as well. And looking at the East Marsh, we've got 4 generations of unemployed people didn't recover from the fishing. You know, some of my mates that grew up on the same block are dead from drugs and things like this. You know, they just didn't have the resilience, they didn't have the skill set to be able to lift themselves out of the morass. And I think if you're looking at education, I don't think you start with institutions. I think you start with people where they are. And we've worked with the WEA and have a community education branch of the WEA because, like Freire, we believe that everybody comes along not as empty vessels, but with their own experience and with their own stories to tell. And people grow from that. And in terms of that link between education and work, I mean, the new framework that we've got passed, but still relevant, Broken Windows, is community wealth building. And we ran a number of workshops last year at Blundell Park. And we got a great mix of business, academia, community, and politics there in the same room talking about the framework of community wealth building. So there's two elements to it, really. It's very straightforward. Stop wealth extraction, increase wealth generation. And if you're doing that from a community perspective, then it actually is relevant to each and every person in that community, and you build from that point of view. So we broke our community wealth building down into 3 different threads. One is housing, because if you don't nail that thing called home for each and every person and each and every family, then forget community, because that's where it begins. And if people don't have good homes, then you can't move forward. The next one is employment, and that's absolutely tied to it. But the third one, and really importantly, is the coming generation. How often do you go to high-level discussions and there are no young people in the room? You know, they're the people we're doing all this for. The only thing we can do before we leave the planet is to lay some foundations. Now, those foundations need to be really strong and with the kind of values that Jason's been talking about. It's very relational, and it's about love, and it's about trust. And I think, yeah, that's where we are.
I was just going to add that this is a story from 10 years ago. The Treasury was desperately looking to save money. What could they cut? And a senior civil servant in the Treasury said, why don't we close the colleges of further education? And the explanation was, nobody would notice. Now that tells you who the senior civil servant in the Treasury thought was somebody and who was nobody. Right? Let's hear another question. In fact, let's take two or three.
Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It's been really interesting. I think from the interesting thing has been from the Oxford perspective, how could we use some of the lessons that you've learned when we're addressing some of the most deprived communities in the whole of the UK as part of Oxford City? So that's a really important side of it. And I think there's two things I've taken out of it. The word connectors, I love that. And how do you find these people? I mean, okay, you've got some great people on the panel who've been, somehow have got involved in doing things. How do you go out and find those people and get them really energized and involved? And do you, in terms of local government, is local government an enabler, or do you just want them to get out of the way and make it happen through the local community groups, the local population? So, sorry about that.
Local government.
Local government, I mean, one of the really interesting things for me is if you start to talk to, I mean, we started just by having a load of conversations, almost like community organising. And community organising is part of the thesis as well, by the way, is that we're working with a friend of Maurice Glassman, who's in the House of Lords as well, but he's a community organiser by background as well as an academic. And so part of the thesis is you build relationships, and it's not instrumental as well. It's genuinely about meeting people and trying to work out where you have common bonds, common interests. If you think about local government in the same way, I think part of the system and the fragility of that system is that the local government are seen as the gatekeepers of funding, and often with the sort of statutory services, with all the austerity, that all they can fund is statutory stuff. So at the end of the day, you've got all these really, well, not always, you've got a lot of well-meaning people and good people who are also citizens who live in the community, send their kids to school, use the hospital, and yet this antagonism has been set up. And it is real, actually. So part of what we're trying to do is hold a space where people come just as citizens, as individuals, and they're allowed to tell their stories as well. And I think part of it is recognising our sort of professional capabilities and our own individual capabilities at the same time, but just acknowledging people's humanity as well. So we've got the leader of the council and the CEO of the council that come to our group meetings, and they'll sit at a table like everybody else. And they've came to us after, I don't think they mind me saying this, but they've really enjoyed the ability to participate in the conversation rather than the people who have to say no to stuff because the money's run out and austerity is just taken. And these are all mostly good people. And, I've met a few that aren't, I won't mention that. But there's the majority of them are good people that care about the community. So I think there's part of that. There's part of allowing them to be funded properly. I think, you know, that's a whole other political conversation. But, you know, one of the things about being an entrepreneur is that you're basically unemployable and you can't have a boss. That's why I've had to do the things I've done. And so being able to work in partnership with people is how I built my career, and that's why I enjoy, gives me energy. And if people want to be a partner, they can be. And they're stepping into that conversation. They're good people who care about what we're doing. And it's trying to reset the level of dialogue, so it's not a them and us. We all want the same story, which is to define a new narrative for our community together. And so I don't know if that's been your experience, Jason, because the scarcity of funding has also created some antagonism, because if they're saying yes to someone, they're also saying no to 10 others. And more often than not, they're saying no to 10 at the moment, unfortunately. So I don't know if that's been your experience with the local government.
It is. You know, you're almost set up into a kind of gladiatorial system. You know, you're fighting for resources. It's them and us. You know, the council is impenetrable. You can't get to talk to the right people. The funding system is ridiculously difficult. So what do? Well, you build relationships. You have difficult conversations with people that you might not necessarily think that you can work with, but you find actually they care about the same things that you do. They might present it in a different way, but they do care. And you asset map. You don't look at what the deficit is all the time. You know, you were talking about camping on the problem. That is deficit-led. That's where is there a lack. Look at what there is in terms of strength. So in your deprived communities in Oxford City, who are the leaders? Who are the people that are running that community centre on a Tuesday morning? What do they need? If you could bring somebody along that could support and help shape their work, you're building up that strength base. And so you're not talking from the point of view of lack and having to shove something in. You're saying, well, actually, Doreen runs that food bank and she's amazing, but she needs 10 other people to come in and help sort it out on a Tuesday. And there's a lad who runs a man shed over there, and there's a load of guys that go and talk on a Monday night. That's how you do it. And you know where they are, and then that's when you connect. And so you're building relationships all the time.
Just quickly to your point about how do you find the people that can do the work, is it so we're trying to publicise this, so part of being here tonight is that we're trying to build an evidence case that we can help other people. I write a column in The Guardian monthly about football and social change, and so trying to publicise as well from my background, trying to make sure people know there's a story. I had a call yesterday, I won't mention who it is, but a philanthropist from a very wealthy household name family had read one of my articles and wants to meet. So, and then obviously Paul and Joe can convene through the powers of Oxford and the House of Lords, etc. So I think it's just fine. There are good people that want to do this work, so it's by any means necessary, is probably the short answer.
Could I just
The
chip
gentleman
in?
just at the back who looks like a younger version of me. Yeah.
Paul, could I just chip in briefly, if that's okay? Paul?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So,
I'm so
I
sorry.
mean, first of all, you know, you just don't think of Oxford and deprivation, do you? But there's all this hidden poverty in a lot of places. And one of the reasons we're doing a housing project, we want 100 houses, and we're saying it's 100 houses for 100 years, so it's generational. But that will give us a sustainable rent every year so that we can pay for our core operations, the money we can't get from anywhere else. So the first thing I'd say is aim at getting some assets for the community, because that is the only thing that gives you sustainability. The other thing I'd say is that we're kind of trying to do that in Grimsby. We're having an East Marsh community-led housing summit on the 14th of June. And the idea is that we'll share what we've done and, you know, the pitfalls and the progress and whatever, but we're sharing it with other wards from around the town to see if they'd be interested in developing their own community-led housing. And I'd be glad to invite some of your gang to Grimsby for that, or any other time, because I think that's the thing. You know, I'm really interested in getting a Sharrow-bank to Blackpool now, after listening to you, Joe.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, but that's the thing. We had a fantastic meeting just before lockdown with a fantastic group of people from Deptford, wasn't it? And just that mix and talking to people from a different experience, I think, could be really, really helpful.
Yes, my grandparents and my parents had a shop on the East Marsh, actually, and I think that the work that you're all doing is fantastic. I wondered I think that the issues in Grimsby, three of the key issues, are drugs, lack of a proper railway, which of course is exacerbated by the problems with TransPennine, and also really the poverty of aspiration that there is. That you've got some really fantastic young people, but for some reason less go through to university. And I agree, we've got a great further education college. I wonder if you thought one of the priorities might be to get a university there, which in many parts of the country has sparked revival and spin-offs and so on. And I think the point about alumni is really important, and it may be that there are some people in the audience from Grimsby, but I do run, we have a Teams call 4 times a year to discuss matters about Grimsby. If anybody is interested, then let me know. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. I mean, the sort of societal level stuff around drugs is real. The railway definitely needs fixing. Like, part of the problem is when we're inviting people from the network to come to Grimsby, invariably it takes them a day to get there. And it's, the TransPennine Express have just lost their licence. As a result, that's going to be nationalised again. But it's just very simple things. We had some people up yesterday, and it took them like 6 hours from London, which, there used to be a direct train. The rumour comes around again and again that the direct train's getting connected, which would be a couple of hours. But that matters, that really matters. So that's where the government infrastructure can happen. And then the aspiration stuff. So I agree to a point on that. I agree with the data about who goes on to university, etc. But I meet kids in the town all the time that are full of energy and aspiration, enthusiasm. What they lack is a route sometimes. So part of the on-site youth zone that we're building, and again, I can't recommend this enough if people want to come and see an on-site youth zone, but it's to build that aspiration, it's to create a youth environment where people come in, schools do their work, and unfortunately a lot of it is how do they fulfill their Ofsted obligations. But actually we think there's a parallel track which is about how you build aspiration. So the youth zone is a proper state-of-the-art facility with 20 different activities, but more importantly, it has proper youth work and it enables kids to reach their potential, that's in music or the arts or sport or whatever, quite frankly. And so I think that's the deficit that we're hoping that the onsite will be part of the solution. But that's big. We've got a youth development group, which is kids from the town are designing it and telling us what we want. And I mean, no lack of kids who've got aspirations. So I think it's a real problem, but it's where the aspiration falls off. And so just telling the story about what's available and what opportunities exist, I think is as much the challenge as it is. Actually, I think the opportunities are there. I'll give you a quick example. When I left school, because I wasn't particularly academic, they literally did a careers test. It was a computer, and just spat out, it said, just join the army. And that was it. That was one option. I was like, there must be other options. I was like, no, you should join the army. Unfortunately, like I said, an army would not be a good suggestion for me for many reasons, but I just think interesting about where they're getting that inspiration and leadership. So part of the Home Win group, which John's kindly a part of, is showing what the possibility is. I'll tell one quick story. So one of the things we've done is we've engaged with an organiser, a phenomenal entrepreneur called Margaret McCabe, who built something called Debate Mate, which is basically teaching kids debating skills. It's a 10-week course, and it takes kids from not being able to speak up in class to standing up. And the final was yesterday in Oxford. The Grimsby School came third nationally, and it's from one of the tough awards in Grimsby. And some of those kids would not speak up in class 10 weeks ago. So again, just these sort of initiatives where you show kids what's possible. So John showed them around Brasenose. Those kids were in one of the colleges debating yesterday. And I'm convinced a couple of those kids in 5-10 years from now will be in this university, right? So it's just, again, just opening the art of what is possible so kids can see it and believe they can be it, basically.
Well, actually, there was one girl in that Littlefields team who I wanted to give a place in Brasenose now, and she was only 11. She was absolutely extraordinary.
Good, brilliant. I know that kid. I know what you mean.
We do have a very creative and dynamic group of young people who have self-organised. There are two very good young leaders, Matty and Lisa, who work with all of us, and they have off their own bat set up a network of young people looking at creative opportunities, networking across the town, sort of really building something for themselves. I think it's less that there is aspiration, there is ambition, there is hope, but often when you can't see roots, you know, to what you might actually do in terms of a career or a life, or it's really hard for you to make a home in a place, then that aspiration just becomes, it's cauterized and it's heartbreaking. You know, I'm of the generation, like you, Jason, I went to university for free. You know, I bought my first house when I was 26. You know, and I'm looking at young people that I'm working with and mentoring now, they're still living in their childhood bedroom. They'll never be able to buy a house. And the job, they've got 5 jobs, thank you very much, but not one of those jobs will ever pay them enough. And, you know, that's what we're up against. And so, you know, I champion young people, and I think they're brave and kind and beautiful, and we just need to do way, way, way more, not for them, with them. And that's what we need to be doing.
So Matt and Lisa, who Josie introduced us to, they run a theatre group. They're in their early 20s, both of them. And so we put on a festival 6 months ago, which was about careers and aspiration in the town. They built the festival, they ran the festival. It was entirely their work. But we put some resources behind them and some moral support and some energy. But they are now showing what is possible in the town. So again, it's just about connecting and enabling people that want to do this work already.
Right, thank you. My name's Mina. I'm very fortunate to have worked in an independent community centre in Sydney, in Australia, for several years before coming here recently. And there's just, I'm really getting so much out of this panel, thank you. And there's a lot of, so much that's similar and different compared to working in community development in Australia. Being an independent community centre means we're not funded. And so also had to find resources and funding and work, and so much is in common with what you've been saying. We're also very fortunate that one of our recent ambassadors is an Australian sporting hero, Craig Foster, who's worked a lot to mobilise the sporting community for human rights, against domestic and family violence, women in sport, girls in sport, but also very much engaged with helping refugees settle in the new community. And I've noticed no one's mentioned new immigrants or refugees in the context of building stronger communities. And in Australia, at least, not only are they the poorest and the least resourced people in our communities, but they're also the most who want to make home desperately, who have so much to give and are such resilient people that half of our volunteers, we run a food rescue food bank, so we're diverting food from going to landfill, making it available to anyone who needs it at low cost. More than half of our volunteers are new migrants and refugees in our area.
Just respond to that really quickly. The reason it hasn't been mentioned is that there's no differential in the town. So whoever wants to participate in that, whether there's a need, whether there's a willingness to step into the conversation. So it's not that it's excluded anyway. It just feels like, you know, for the community, it's whoever turns up, quite frankly, and who wants to be part of the conversation.
I'm now operating in several places or sponsoring some activity, and if I think about Blackpool in connection to refugees, there's a very strong non-refugee community in Blackpool. So there's a Sangrenons that sort of, and I don't know how this translates into East Marsh, but it's a. So there's they were originally the traveller community, actually, I think, in Blackpool. But anyway, there's a very strong sense there. If I look at Coventry, where we're doing some work, there's something called Positive Youth Foundation, which is absolutely brilliant, working with refugees who've just landed in Coventry. And I think Coventry takes a lot of refugees, and motivating. And as you say, you know, if you've crossed continents to get here, boy, are you resilient, and so you pick up some of that. Translating that so that you can get jobs locally is what Positive Youth Foundation tries to help with, because it doesn't always marry terribly well. But I just wondered, I mean, I guess in Blackpool, most of the migration is migration from within the UK. So you've got a lot of Liverpudlian, Glaswegian, sort of northern people who used to come on staycation, come for a couple of weeks to holiday in Blackpool. So it's just a different type of in-migration and out-migration. actually is also a big issue with a lot of these places, is brain drain. So there's all that bit as well.
There's not a lot of diversity in the town. So, I mean, it's a reality of where we are geographically and ethnically, and that's not for any reason. It's the kindest, most open and loving community you can be part of, but the reality of it is it's a predominantly white community, and that kind of is what it is.
There are small pockets where we know we've got some refugees living in the East Marsh, and often, you know, it's a hard place to find yourself, and often not necessarily the most welcoming, but there are really good initiatives that are happening, and we're starting to meet people now who are doing that work with refugees and migrants, and it is important.
Can I just ask, given Grimsby's history versus Blackpool's history, one of the things that really surprised me starting working in Blackpool is how open people in Blackpool were to my coming in and talking. I mean, they obviously think, you know, posh girl from down south, but they you know, there wasn't this sort of territoriality that I'm very used to in working with different community groups. But I think that's partly because they have something like 20 million tourists a year, and the local residents are about 160,000. So you get different characteristics of different communities. But is Grimsby an open community in the same way, or is it inward-looking because of its history?
I think it's both. Do you want to speak to that, Billy?
Just that, actually, talking about inward migration, we have a lot of people from down south now in Grimsby, a lot, because they can't afford the houses in the south anymore, so they come to places where the houses are cheap. And they've become integral part of our community. You know, they've just thrown themselves in it. This is what we're finding, that they want to remake their home. And it's this little but powerful word again, home. Yeah. And it takes effort to make a home. And it seems to me that they're coming in and actually grabbing this opportunity.
Yeah, interesting.
In response to your question, one of the things that, and Emily's my business partner has been a great tutor on this, is that there is a lot of sort of people that come and look and are interested in the problems of the town and then disappear. So we're trying to stop that. There was a lot of sort of poverty tourism where a lot of the press on the town was people coming and going, oh, isn't it bad? And then they disappear. So we try and run events twice a year where if you're interested in coming and standing shoulder to shoulder, come and get stuck in. But I think part of the thing is like people come and they sort of wring their hands about how bad it is, and then nothing happens, and we're trying to stop that.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, we're saying if you want to come, step into the conversation, be a partner for the long term. And I think that's all Emily's insight.
And don't come with ready-made solutions.
Yeah, exactly. I think if someone turns up and just wants to listen and be part of the conversation, I think people are made very welcome. But people that come and stand and point or come with an answer, it tends just not to work. Wherever you go, I would suggest, not just in Grimsby, but...
It was such an animated group of people, but in a few minutes we're about to turn into pumpkins. And so let's hear from you, and then at some stage we'll have a good last word to Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very impressed by what you've said and very stimulated by it. I'm really struck by this issue around mental health and the high levels of suicides, and I don't know, is it the mental health is going to be the biggest disease burden of by 2050 or something in the world. So mental health seems to be a really important aspect. And one of the things that we've been doing is trying to connect and build community through growing food and growing food together. And I wonder if you've done anything around connecting people in food growing or nature-based approaches to addressing mental health issues.
Thank you. Can we just get
I've got my orders, I'm answering this one. So we come a bit late to the table, but we're just being gifted a biggish plot of land from a local housing association that we work with. And we've got loads of aspirations for that, and we also think that that's the way forward. And I think Jason could talk really well about how our future is just wrapped in green stories. And I was shocked by what Jason said about the suicide rate where we are as well. I'd not heard that, and it doesn't surprise me. And it's something about this idea of, you know, being the strong man and actually not being able to be the strong man anymore, because you can't be the wage earner anymore because there's no wages to earn, but you've still got that expectation. And so in the midst of all that, there is a lot of anger around our streets, and it erupts every so often in violence, and clearly it erupts silently in the end of people's lives, and it's really frightening. One of the things we've been doing is holding person-centred groups where literally we'll just sit together for 2 hours every week for 8 weeks and just be. And the power of that has been transformational for us. We've both done it, and it's just remarkable.
Can I just say something very quickly about mental health? It is an absolute crisis, but what we are in danger of doing is citing the responsibility for it in individuals, and we need to look at why people's mental health is so bad, and the material conditions of people's lives are causing this crisis. And we're not being honest about that. We're saying, have a 6 weeks online CBT course and have these pills and you'll be all right. No, that's not good enough.
The specific around food production, I apologize, but I can't remember the name, but there is an organisation that's taken over a farm on the edge of town, as well as producing food for the food banks, and there are far too many food banks in the town as well, but there are people trying to connect the activity to the table as well, but I apologise, I can't remember the name of the organisation.
I mean, I would just say on mental health, we have a ward, Claremont in Blackpool, which would, I guess, be similar to the East Marsh situation. But this everything, everywhere, all at once, I mean, we just have to put our arms around all of it. So you've got youth clubs where these children are living in appalling conditions. Domestic violence, but everything is wrong. So just getting them out and into a different environment, and then we do various things with them once they're in the youth club. But we have to work from cradle to career really with them. As you were talking earlier, the employment is one of the good things you can do around mental health. A lot of them in Claremont. In fact, we've got an on-site guy helping look at what's going on in Claremont. There are certainly people there who are not capable of holding down a job for a full day, and so we're looking at sort of 2-hour stints and sort of journey through.
Thank you. You all tell such inspirational stories, and I could ask lots of questions, but I'm just going to focus on one. But to put that in context, if I may, because there's been reference this evening to Oxford and Oxfordshire, and I don't like doing it in this simple way, but in the time we have, Oxfordshire is about 1% of England's population, but in definition of the most deprived areas, we have 4% by number of population. But so to come back to the issue, we have relatively recently formed an inclusivity partnership here, which is bringing together education, voluntary sector, business, and the universities with the local authorities. I think to end on a how tonight, I would love to hear more practically about how you've brought business into your endeavours. In a really practical way, how have you, as it were, told your stories locally to get businesses to understand how and where they can be doing more?
I love that question. I can take that really quickly answers that we haven't. So I've got the inspiration for me tonight in meeting Joe is that I need to follow up because we've come in slightly differently. It was building the community level, but one of my frustrations has been the lack of the business community stepping in. And I'm trying to think about have we invited them in the right. We've had people come to meetings, but there hasn't been a lot of funding or a lot of enthusiasm. So that's for me. That's a big question, and I'd love some help on answering that because it sounds like you've got a framework and some sort of national clout that could maybe activate that because we haven't been successful yet. So I thank you for the question, and I give myself an action off the back of that to come back with an answer maybe a year from now.
I've got to answer that question in about half a minute, so let me see what I can do. It's an art form, so people in this sort of world aren't very used to talking to business leaders. So that's that hurdle needs to be got over. As you know, it's what I've done all my life. But it's the same relationship building that you've been talking about. It's just one needs to face in a different direction. And a lot of people lack confidence, particularly if you're trying to raise money as well as talk to them. I think what people, if they're in the charitable and public policy world, make the mistake of doing is thinking that these people are talking public policy to you. You know, the businesses are bored to tears with anything blah, 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 and the theory of change or whatever it is, you know. All the stuff that sits around this is not their bag, you know. Tell me what I can do and I'll do it tomorrow. Also, that attitude, tell me what I can do and I'll do it tomorrow, is not normally the most useful thing they can actually do, but that's the way they process stuff. So there's a lot of sort of cultural behaviours on both sides which make it a little bit challenging. The business community, you do in theory already have businesses that are stepping up and saying we'd like to play, as it were. Actually, when you get down to Grimsby level or Blackpool level, most of them haven't got a footprint in Blackpool or Grimsby, so you've got to go and get the locals. On the whole, the people you want to take it seriously aren't taking it seriously, because if they were, they'd already be doing stuff. So there's quite a lot of sort of showing them it can be done exactly the same way as you have to bring the council on side. You've got to show the business people that you can work in a way that is their style of working, which is what's the problem, what's the solution, tell me what to do tomorrow sort of thing. And then that you can get results. So it's I don't think there is an easy answer. I go and speak to the senior people in the local businesses up front. That's the first thing I do, is go and find the most senior person in the local business. But then I'm a baroness, so it's a bit easier to get in the door.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. I just want to wrap up with returning us to this appalling statistic that Blackpool is number 1 in
Male
suicide and Grimsby is number 2. We know really quite a lot about male suicide now. This is the study by Nobel laureate Angus Deaton and his wife Anne Case, which they call deaths of despair. We also know quite a lot about the social psychology of how you get out of it. And it is an absolute disgrace that these problems have persisted, given how much research we've now got. It is an incredible and embarrassing and humiliating failure of our country. And on that, I would just like to say we're all welcome to have a drink and a discussion, and I would very much encourage you to come and join us, because there's so many things, so many hairs we've started running, which we can take further. So thank you very much. You've been a fantastic panel.